How do you build relationships? How do you build trust with your athletes, with your coaches? Now, I'm sure that if I asked you that question, you might have a couple ideas. Except today, that's the question that I ask the former Arizona Diamondbacks mental performance coach, Zach Brandon. I first heard Zach interviewing Chris Peterson, the former Washington football coach, on his podcast, Win More, Live Better. And honestly, I couldn't stop listening to Zach, right? Coach Peterson was fantastic. But it was Zach's questions that just blew me away. He was so deeply curious and intentional with his questions that he was taking Peterson to a real level of depth in the conversation that I honestly believe most podcast hosts are unable to do or don't do. And it really got Coach Peterson reflecting on himself. And actually, you could start to see a relationship form in that episode. Since then, I've not just been a big fan of Zach's, but I've become a bit of a friend of Zach's as we started to talk regularly as he has transitioned from the Arizona Diamondbacks mental performance coach to starting his own coaching business, coaching coaches. You can learn more about Zach Brandon at zachbrandoncoaching.com. His podcast is probably one of the 4 or 5 podcasts that I subscribe to. It's called Win More, Live Better. And like I said, if you want to learn more about him, head on over to zachbrandoncoaching.com. Welcome back to the Coaching Culture Podcast. My name is JP Nurbin. I'm an executive coach and facilitator working with leaders and teams who are striving for high performance. I started this podcast in 2017 to help others and myself grow as leaders and to learn how to build better team cultures. Since then, I've also had a newsletter, and every week in the newsletter, there's 3 things. You get the notes to that week's episode, you get a short article from myself, and you get a weekly culture building tool. That tool comes from our TOC Coach library. TOC Coach is our online community, online courses for coaches and we provide group coaching there. We also have a resource database of really practical resources. So if you'd like to get access to some of those, each week we're dropping one on the newsletter. Subscribe to the newsletter at tocculture.com, and you can learn more about our online community over there. Zach, I'm really excited for this conversation. You have no idea. I know I've shared a little bit, but you have no idea how much your podcast, the way that you interview guests, has had an impact on me in the last few years. I think it's made me, listening to your podcast has made me a better host of a podcast host. So excited for this conversation, man.
Yeah, no, JP, I'm honored first and foremost. I said before we hit record, this might be your first ever episode where the guest asks more questions of you, because I've learned a great deal in all of our conversations that we've already had pertaining to culture and leadership and coaching. So more than anything, I'm excited for the conversation and grateful for the opportunity to share.
Well, hopefully I won't let that happen, but let's start with this question, which is just what's most important for our listeners to know about you as we start our conversation today?
I think top of mind for me is I've been really fortunate, I think, in the last 2.5 years now to probably pivot in essence in terms of my role or my responsibility, because I would say that my primary job is being a dad. So 2.5 years ago was when our son was born. Our son was actually born mid World Series as we were playing the Rangers. So that was quite an eventful period for a number of reasons. But it's been more than anything, I think that's become kind of my new favorite thing in life for a number of reasons. And then we were really lucky. My wife and I, we welcomed our daughter, who's 8 months old who's 8 months old now, to our family back in September of last year. So I say all that because what people routinely bring up when I share all of this is they're like, oh, then you guys are in it right now. And I don't quite know what in it means. But what I will say is our home, it's beautiful chaos at the moment. So I'm also saying all of that to preface, if I say anything that doesn't make any bit of sense, I'm 100% using my dad brain as my excuse. So I'm just level setting expectations here to start. But more than anything, that's become kind of my new favorite thing in many ways. So I think maybe something that won't be found in a quote unquote resume or CV, but definitely meaningful for me.
And you said your son was born during the World Series. as you're working with the Diamondbacks. I'm curious, those few months after that, working and continuing, and let's say the year after that, you stay on. Your role within the Diamondbacks change, but your role within your family starts to change. You said it was the number one job. Was it the number one job right away, or is that maybe what's pulled you to maybe make a bit of a shift in your career?
Um, I think yes to a degree in both of those questions. I think it's really interesting for me because I get asked a lot about, what that World Series run was like for us in 2023 and highlights and things that I felt like maybe helped lead to that moment. And I think there's a lot of different factors. There's never just one singular story that explains it, obviously. But for whatever reason, one of my actually most vivid memories of the World Series was actually what transpired afterwards. So my son was born right after game two. And so we ended up playing for three more games. And unfortunately, we didn't win any of those games. So we were eliminated. And 2 days after, we had thankfully been checked out of the hospital. And I had to go to the stadium to clean out my locker. And I just remember for whatever reason looking into this like empty locker room and thinking to myself, like this I would have done this a month ago had we gotten eliminated, at the end of the regular season and our season was done. Like it was going to be the same kind of regardless. I was going to have to, and I think when you go on a run like that, you start to suspend all the other things that you have going on in your life, the chores that you need to do, the errands that you need to run. But what I share that because I thought it was a really visceral moment for me on a personal level. We talk about like the arrival fallacy or the illusion that once you achieve things or like you have achievement oriented success, it's going to change your life. The reality is it's like, nope, like it didn't really change a whole lot from a personal or professional level going on that run. But having kids has very much shaped it, has
Mm.
very much changed, I think, the priorities. And I think they did pretty quickly. Um, in some ways. And I think to that point, as you kind of alluded to, 6 months ago, I made the decision to leave my full time role to kind of pursue my own thing. And really at the heart of that, the one of the main catalysts was to not be so distant, physically distant from my family. And so anyway, I say all that from the standpoint of, yeah, I do think kids has helped very much shape that. But I think what they've also illuminated is this notion that you can, not to say that we don't want to achieve things, not to say that it's not valuable to go out and pursue more achievement oriented success, but I think it was a really stark realization for me to like, oh, my life is not going to change that much whether we had won a World Series or whether we had fallen a couple games short.
Mm. You and I, the work that we do within teams and with leaders and with performers, it's there's a lot of similarities, there's a lot of crossover. And I wonder, it's really hard. I mean, you can read a bio what people put on a website um, around that role that you had within the Diamondbacks. But when you were at your best in your role, what was the most important part of your role?
I think I'll open by sharing, I think, a failure or a long learning curve that I had, but I think it'll lead to that answer. When you become, either a director or you take over like a head coaching seat, you go from being this individual, quote unquote expert in whatever your given craft is to now you're in charge of the group and you're in charge of the collective. And now you're responsible for not just your own individual output, but also others. And I think early on, I kind of struggled with that transition because I was so used to trying to just be a high performer for myself. And I I think just took for granted that our team would be able to kind of run efficiently without some guidance, without extra support and so forth. And I think they say all that because they certainly I think could, and they did in many ways as I was trying to stumble through this thing we call leadership. However, um, what I found was I got a lot better as a leader when I like showed up every day from a space of like, hey, how can I serve you? What can I do to support you today? Right? What is it that you need from me today? Like, do you need a space to process? Do you need encouragement? Do you need a challenge? Do you need direction? Just, I think showing up with more intention and, something that was really important for us, we had just within our department, but we ended up, this has been scaled on a much larger scale across the org that I was fortunate to play a role in. We, we sat down one Saturday during the off season, and me and our team, all in the middle performance department, we sat down and asked ourselves, okay, what makes we use the term in baseball 80 grade, which basically means like I don't know what the equivalent is in other sports, but 80 grade is like the elite of the elite, like it's Hall of Fame level caliber. So we asked ourselves, what's an 80 grade mental coach for the Arizona Diamondbacks?
Mm.
And that was our guiding North Star question. And then we reverse engineered it to ask ourselves, what do we need to show up, or how do we need to show up to do that? And we created values, and then we created core behaviors that we felt like, in essence, would help kind of bring that out on a day to day basis. So I share all that because I think when I was at my best, it was probably when I was most aligned with those values, which for us was connect, impact, and grow. So every day we wanted to show up and think about how can we strengthen a relationship with someone today? How can I show up and leave somebody better after a conversation than when we began? And I think there's different ways to do that. And then also ultimately, how have I grown? Or like, what's one way that I've improved myself or my craft today? And I think just those as guiding questions became really important. So I think when I was at my best, I don't know if there was a singular moment as much as it tended to be when those values were most top of mind and I was being more intentional to show up day to day trying to live those.
When you're in that space, you're living those. What did you enjoy about that?
Connection is all, I mean, I think all three of those values are very we use them as a department, but I think they're a pretty good barometer for myself too on a personal level. So what I think fills my cup in many ways is connection. I think it's Seth Godin. He says like everybody's kind of talking about we're living in this like creator economy right now, and he was like, I think the richness, the value is actually a connection economy. Like the relationships that you form with other people is really where there's the most value, not just from a personal lens, but also in how you can then contribute to others and contribute to a community and so forth. So I say all that because community has already always been really important to me and connection and just getting to talk to people from like yourself from all over in different spaces and different arenas. And then the growth is, I think, another one that very much aligns with my own. I'm a avid, I like to read, I like to listen to podcasts. I have no system for that. I'll be the first to say, so don't ask me what my system is. Like I just kind of follow rabbit holes and go down different paper trails based off of, either who has a nice thumbnail that catches my attention or somebody I have a conversation with you and you mention, a book that I'm like, oh, I gotta like check that out. So I kind of bounce all over, but I always enjoy every day kind of getting to this space of like, how can I learn? How can I grow? What's something, I heard this with, his name is Billy Oppenheimer, and he's like the writing assistant for Ryan Holiday. And I heard him on a podcast share once that everybody likes to talk about like, these hits of dopamine, and he said a lot of people get their dopamine hits from more likes, more follows, the engagement on social and those types of things or in real life. And he said my dopamine hits come when I have a moment of insight or an aha moment where I feel like I have a story or a lesson that like finally hits home or connects for me or for someone else. So on a personal level, I think those values um, they align really well too. I think with just who I am inherently as well.
I mean, like how much, when you think about it, like that type of those dopamine hits from those insights, we're missing those so much today because we aren't creating, we're using AI to create. We are using those apps that take a book and condense it into 1 page or 3 minute read. Like it's just, yeah, it's really cool how he mentions that and how much that connects with your experience.
It, I think with that, again, there will be a theme here, a lot of trial and error, a lot of ongoing practice for myself. But I think, I think that anything that's an extreme can obviously be taken too far. Or like one of my favorite quotes is that like an overused strength can become a limitation. And what I mean by that is like I think I've always been this pretty avid learner, like wanting to seek out information to grow and stuff. But I think it can certainly come to an extent where it actually is either problematic is maybe not the right word, but I think more detrimental. So I'll give you a prime example. There was a stretch there where like I was so into like reading and listening to podcasts, like I didn't create any open space for
Mhm.
like silence. I didn't create any open space for like creative time or just to organize my thoughts. I mean, I'm saying this on air, like I was literally in the shower listening to a podcast. Like I was like, I can't even shower without something going on in the background. And I think finally it was like, what am I doing in here? Like it's okay. And so, I do appreciate that sentiment of like, I think for so many people in any given context that are high achieving, the permission to slow down is not exactly a strength for most.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been for me, and I'm working on it.
I'd say that's one of the, I would resonate with that because in the last year to two, I went from being a guy that finished every book to I probably do not finish half the books I start. I don't finish half the podcast episodes I start today. Why? I'm quick to quit because I don't need to say I finished that book, right? Secondly, when I'm especially like listening to a podcast or even listening to a book, like once I have an insight, pause, keep the run, keep the walk, keep whatever mowing the lawn, whatever you're doing, and just like think about that. Like just spend time with that. And then hopefully I sit down and create the space to write and to create and get that down on paper.
Yeah, no, again, recovering, working, human in progress. I I empathize, and I think for a long time, I remember I still know which book it was that for the very first time I was like, "Nope, I'm stopping. Like I can't read this anymore." And it like pained me. It was not an easy decision for me to stop. And so anyway, I think that permission to slow down, I think this is where like someone like Annie Duke, the professional poker player and whatnot, she has a great book about there are instances, there are moments in life where it is okay to quit, like it is okay to pivot and go in a different direction. And I think we kind of have this very strong negative connotation to the word. And yet, as we know, sometimes the most effective thing that you can do is what you choose to stop doing.
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah. I'm curious. You talked about those values, and one of them that you really leaned into earlier was connection. And I think about your role within, you know, a clubhouse within Arizona Diamondbacks, and you have athletes 18, 19, 20, and you have athletes in their 30s. Totally different, experiences come from different generations. How do you build that connection with these athletes? How do you build that trust?
I used to always appreciate I don't know how often I said this when I started the role in Arizona with like our younger players, but I remember even before that I was at IMG Academy, and I used to always think I was so funny for saying this, by the way, which probably wasn't, but I would always ask at the start of a session. We have these kids come in from all over the world, and some of them, many of the which had not had ever experience doing any sort of mental conditioning work. So I'd ask them at the start, like, who here has had experience with it and whatnot. And when they would say that most of them hadn't, I was like, perfect. I can just like make stuff up in then, and you're not going to have, you're not going to know any different or whatever. So I think with like the younger players, from a standpoint of, I think it is easier from a standpoint of I think many now have grown up in an era where it is more mainstream. It is talked about. You're hearing more anecdotes from, professional athletes or respectable figures talking about the mental side of the game. And so I think that was always one way that I would try to connect with younger players is finding those clips, finding those real life examples and trying to bring it to life for them in our conversations on top of obviously like just building the relationship itself. There is a great interview that I saw with is with Dwayne Wade, and forgive me, I think it's 2006. I might be getting that wrong, but it was with the Miami Heat, and Pat Riley takes over the team midway through. And, one of the things that Dwayne Wade shares in this story is that when he took over, one of the first things he did in this meeting is he started to go around and ask us how much we knew about one another. Like, hey, what's his dad's name? What's his kids' names? And just
Mhm.
asking all of these questions to the players and the staff. And he was like, we didn't know. And I thought it was just a really cool story around, somebody who at the very highest level was deliberately creating space for connection and emphasizing how important that would be before we even talk about X's and O's, before we talk about strategy and physical prep. Let's just talk about like who you're in this room with, because you're more inclined to get a better version of you on the court when you know each other off of it. And so that always resonated, and I share that because something that's always been important for me for connection are like the really basic things. Knowing someone's name, knowing it's not just like, "Hey, how's your wife?" It's like, "Hey, how's, Suzanne doing?" Or whoever it is, right? It's like, "How's Tommy? How's," I don't know why I'm using these names. These are just fictional names. I don't know if I'm talking about anyone here, but the point being that is a very different level of connection. And so one of the things that we even did, as like a thought experiment is at one given time, and it was actually kind of cool because I later had a conversation with Kevin Eastman, who, when he was with the Celtics, they, I guess, did a very similar version of this. But we wrote down every player that we had in our organization, and we put the three of us as mental performance coaches, and we went through and we graded our relationships with every guy. Now, the
Mhm.
point was to not have a 5 out of 5 relationship with every person. Like, that's not realistic. But what we did want to identify is where there were gaps. Where was there somebody who maybe didn't have the best relationship, or there was somebody that hadn't, we needed to nurture one with? Or is there a situation where, yes, this is the player that maybe I'm the one spending the most time with, but my teammate Charlie over here or my teammate Sydney, like they actually have an even better relationship. Let me leverage them.
Mhm.
Like, let's get them into the fold here. So I say all that because that was always something that we prioritized. We even literally quantified it and tried to have depth of relationships that we fostered with players. So I share all that because that's on a much grander scale. And then the one other thing I would add is you mentioned the older players. Like I had players and coaches that had been doing this, almost since I was born when I took the job, when I first started. And so there was a lot of like imposter syndrome. There was a lot of like, who am I to tell these individuals how to do things? And many of which have been extremely successful without formal training in it. I relied really heavily on asking them for advice and using that to get to know them and how their mind worked and what their mental game looked like. So I didn't realize it at the time, but this is also something. Her name is Katie Milkman. She wrote a book, like I think it's either How to Change or How People Change. I can't remember the exact title, but one of the things in her book is she talks about if you want to instill confidence in people, what sometimes happens is we just flood people with suggestions. We just flood people with recommendations. Oh, you should try this, do this. And what it comes sometimes inherently implies is that you're inadequate. That person's sitting there like, oh, well, they're telling me all these suggestions. They're giving me all of these
Hmm.
things to do because maybe I'm lacking it. Whereas what she offers is one other way that you can think about instilling confidence is to ask somebody for what advice they would give to someone else about whatever it is. So I would do that. I would go up to a major league player and ask them, say, hey, like we have this player down in AA who's struggling bouncing back after a tough outing. What have you found you most useful? Like what works for you? Now, there was a lot of instances where that was a legitimate scenario that I'd be asking about. There were also times where I would honestly just make it up because I just wanted to know what he would say. And that was for me, I think for some of those older veteran players, I guess how I would approach a lot of that. And I think what it also then did is it gave me a reference point to come back to 3 months from
Hmm.
now when they have a tough outing that doesn't go their way. It's like, "Hey, you remember when you were sharing that with, like, this is what you would
Hmm.
recommend to some of those younger guys? Like, what's making that so difficult now?"
Hmm.
Or what are the things that have helped you in the past that maybe you've stopped doing and so forth? And so I think in terms of connection, letting each person you come in contact with letting each person you come into contact with being the expert on themselves and allowing them to share their expertise. Because I think anytime you ask somebody for advice or insight, like more often than not, they feel honored and appreciative to be able to share. And I don't know that we do that sometimes enough for players.
Hmm. I remember maybe it was Adam Grant. I heard him talk about how with your neighbor, say you live next door to someone, it's a better move to ask for help than offer help for the relationship by you.
I love that. I love that.
Mm.
I can see that, and it does sound like an Adam Grant thing. It sounds really good, so it's probably an Adam Grant thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think about, I was thinking, I was just taking down notes. Okay. What's Zach's 3 tips to build a connection with players? And you talked about early on in the IMG, like, okay, showing and competency that you can provide value, right? Like, is an important one. Um, Learning the names, learning the little details about them. It's so stinking important. It's the hardest thing in my role because I work with various teams and I come in sometimes once a year, sometimes a handful of times a year, sometimes at most like once every 2 weeks. It's like, wow. And you got a team of 30 athletes, like really hard to learn those coaches and those athletes' names, right? So like going, like if you don't know the name, you're not going anywhere in that conversation. So that's really good. But like, I just love this thing around asking for advice. I think it's so empowering to the other person. And yeah, that's really good advice. I could see coaches doing that early on. That's why one of the biggest things I always recommend for coaches when you're resetting a program's culture or you're trying to build any culture is just start with questions, asking them for advice, asking their perspective and advice. Like, what do you enjoy? What do you not enjoy? And what's one thing that I should change? Or what's one thing you would change if you were me? Like just these pieces of advice start to build that trust actually.
And I just offered just 2 quick anecdotes to that, and I think, we're talking about this, we started with, at a youth level and these young athletes, but again, we've broadened this to, um, older players, and I mentioned baseball, but, there was a great article, I wanna say this came out this winter with, Joe Mazzula and the Celtics, and one of the things that he did during a film session is, forgive me, I can't remember which player it was, but there was a star player that for whatever reason was going to miss their next game. They were going to have to do some lineup adjustments and make some changes from a tactical standpoint. And so he goes into the meeting and rather than say, all right, here's the plan, this is what we're going to do, he asked him, he's like, what would you do if you were me?
Mm.
And he asked the players, and I was like, "That's a great I mean, what a great way to, 1, instill that ownership, to empower, to use your word, and to, I think, again, leverage the expertise in the room. That's even something that I've seen even in my time in professional baseball. I've seen a lot of meetings, a lot of scouting meetings, and I think sometimes the most effective ones or the most impactful ones when the players spoke up the most, like when they shared, hey, this was been my experience, or this is what I'm seeing from this, and not just what are we reading off, from a scouting report, data driven, that's all important. There's a place for that. And yeah, I find that goes a long way when the players drive it.
When you're a coach with the Diamondbacks full time, what was the hardest part about being a coach for you?
Gosh, how long do we have for the conversation? What if hardest part? I didn't know this until after, or until the very end of my full-time role, but as I reflect back, I think it emerges a lot in my story. Is somebody shared with me that diluted focus produces diluted results, and
Mm.
what I felt a lot of times was, I had my attention on so many things that I felt like I didn't do a lot of them to the level that I wanted to, or to the standard that I thought I could at times. Not always, but there were moments, and I think sometimes that diluted focus, like, yes, that can be things that get thrown on your plate, or circumstances that arise, in a leadership role that you have to attend to, or new things that you have to tackle. And a lot of that was self-induced. A lot of that was feeling as though, you kind of, you wanted to dabble in a lot of different things. And, how do you like learn to like relinquish control and different things like that. And so I think for me, what made it difficult at times was that, um, I think trying to think of what other some big things for me was just like, yeah, learning how to streamline focus. I think,
So just real quick on
w
that. So you were jumping, you were trying to do a lot of things
yeah,
within the
yeah.
role. And those were those more out of feeling the expectation, or was that more out of like just the curiosity, the interest, the achiever?
I think both. I think both. So at one given time, the last few years, my title was head of mental performance and coach development. And so really that, from a job description standpoint, kind of what could be bucketed into three things. One of which was I was the major league mental performance coach. So I was the primary person day to day with our major league team. I oversaw our department, and the team, our full time and our interns within the department. And then I also played this role with coach development, which in essence was facilitating growth development experiences or creating resources for our coaches to learn and grow themselves. And so it's like all three of those things probably could be their own job. Like in essence, you could
Mm.
probably make a case for it. However, um, where I think some of this is, yes, the curiosity, I think this also goes back to how you define success. And how do you define success in your given role? Like, so earlier we were talking about like a lot of people, when you define productivity, it's in the doing. Like most people have a really hard time slowing down, as we talked about earlier, because our definitions of being successful is wrapped around productivity and constantly doing things. So I think some of that was at play. However, like I think what I had to do a better job of is start to define what wins were like, and to start to define kind of the lowest hanging fruit, I guess, in a way, and like just build momentum from that. Because I think sometimes it was like, oh, we could do this, we could do that. Like, and that's the beauty when you lead a department, you have a blank canvas. Like you can kind of ad lib and think in possibilities, and we did that a lot, and it led to great things, but it also has some unintended consequences wrapped into it too. And
Mm.
so yeah, so I don't know that fully, but I think it was a combination.
Here's my challenge on what you just shared, though, is that because you were in those three roles, in some ways, you're better able to help with the coach development because you're in those spaces. And I feel like when we, section off and specialize, and we really lock in our focus that limits us. I should, from personal experience, just finished the book, The Culture Captain. It's coming out next month. And, the experience of writing that while doing the podcast, while, group coaching with many leadership groups, working in sports all over the world, from Australia to, Canada and US, and different age groups, different levels, while doing executive coaching with the coaches and the corporate. Like, I'm doing it all, and I'm like running on fumes. And yet my justification is like, holy crap, I'm learning so much right now. like if I did, oh my gosh, you get off a call and you do something, you're like, okay. And then you just improvise, like you're in this deep learning zone. I just feel like maybe at some point, like it does start to have diluted results, right? And also just a really negative impact on yourself.
And you're offering, I think, a really nice reframe in that I think it does afford things too. And I think that's a really good point where, so what came to mind as you were describing this, I kind of shared this recently because I was going on a little bit of a soapbox, but I heard this, so I was reading this book, and forgive me, I don't remember which book it was, but he's an MIT professor. His name is Nelson Repenning, and all he does is study systems in organizations, audits what's working within them and how to improve them. And he shares this idea that there's like one very basic principle that gets overlooked, that if you want to immediately upgrade your system, whether that's in your team, whether that's in your home life, your organization, and so on, there's one thing that matters immensely. And it's so simple. It's go and see the work. Because what happens is when you move up in a leadership role, you get further and further distant from what's happening in the trenches, what's happening on the ground level where people are actually doing the day-to-day operations. Therefore, you become more reliant on second, third, fourth, fifth hand information or interpretations of what's transpiring. And I bring this up because one thing that I was afforded doing so many things was it allowed me more time and space to go see the work. So what I mean by that is, like, I got to go to the affiliates and see what our coaches were doing there, like what was working, what the challenges were, what their needs were. It gave me an opportunity when I was with the major league team. Yes, my focus was much on our players, but also over time, it shifted dramatically towards our staff. What I think it afforded was spending time in the cages, spending time out on the field, watching how practice was being designed, rather than me make assumptions around what somebody's needs are or what's happening or sometimes what's not happening. The reality is I was able to like go and watch and see it. And he talks about this in the context of like in education, like he talks about a principal going and spending a day as if they were like shadowing a student, so you can apply this in any given context. But I thought that's like such a simple principle. But when you're talking about a larger scale organization or a place where there's multiple departments, multiple different branches, um, there's a lot of judgments. There's a lot of opinions and assumptions formed about what people are doing or not doing. And I think one of the best ways to dispel that is to go see that. Now, that doesn't always mean you can physically go watch, but sometimes that means like talk to them, go ask questions, go ask them about what their pain points are, what their challenges are, what's working, what's not working, and so forth. So, anyway, as you say all that, I do think that was one thing that was afforded, kind of wearing the multiple hats.
All right, that's it for today's episode. And our next episode, we will be back with more with my friend, Zach Brandon. In the meantime, check him out at zachbrandoncoaching.com, and also check out his podcast, Win More, Live Better. Also, if you haven't already, be sure to pick up a copy of my book, The Culture Captain, the 4-level framework to know yourself, lead others, and lead the team. Appreciate the support as always. And be sure to share today's episode if you found it valuable.